I'm Ben Weingarten.
I'm Emily Jashinsky.
I'm Will Chamberlain.
I'm Inez Stepman.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Well, as always, we've got a diverse array of topics to cover this week. I am going to lead us off with the latest developments in Missouri v. Biden, maybe the seminal free speech case in the digital era. Next, Emily is going to talk a little bit about this powwow between Russia and China, the two strategic partners against the U.S. and really most of the West. Will is going to talk a little bit about kind of the information warfare aspect of the war between Israel, Hamas, and other enemies in the region. And then last but not least, Inez will take us home to talk a little bit about what the polling shows regarding what Americans think about Israel and the generational splits on that issue. So I'll kick it off with talking about what's happened in Missouri v. Biden. As everyone here and all of our viewers, I'm sure, are familiar with, Missouri v. Biden is the seminal case in which the plaintiffs allege that a variety of government agencies plus the Biden White House coerced, cajoled, and ultimately colluded with social media companies, sometimes allegedly also using third-party, very closely government-linked cutouts to get the social media companies to de-amplify tweets, slap labels on Facebook posts, and remove content and whole accounts under the guise of combating mis, dis, and malinformation. And there are a number of buckets of content that the plaintiffs allege were suppressed, but among them, of course, there's the Hunter Biden laptop story, virtually everything around questions about election integrity and outcomes in the 2020 election, and then morphing to a focus on all aspects of the coronavirus, from origins to draconian lockdowns to vaccine efficacy, and on and on. And so, as folks know, on July 4th, the judge in the Western District of Louisiana, the district judge overseeing that case, ruled that on the merits, there was great merit, essentially, to the plaintiff's claim that by coercing and pressuring the social media companies to censor, that the social media companies themselves became essentially deputized federal speech police, and that the federal government was likely violating the First Amendment rights of the plaintiffs and millions of Americans by proxy. And so the judge issued this injunction freezing federal government-led speech policing during the pendency of the case. The government immediately challenged that. There were a series of back and forths at the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. Ultimately, a modified form of this injunction was upheld on several of the defendants, though not all of them. The injunction that was upheld was narrower than the one that the judge in Louisiana had imposed. But the feds continued to fight it and appealed it up to the Supreme Court and asked the court essentially to stay the freeze on Fed-led speech policing, that is, freeze the freeze on it and potentially take up the case. And now the feds have granted, the SCOTUS has granted cert. And in granting cert, essentially they're going to grapple with several questions. So among those questions are, one, the question of standing for the plaintiffs in the case, which are the states of Missouri and Louisiana, and prominent dissenting doctors from Covidian orthodoxy, and a conservative website, and a health freedom activist group. They're also going to look at maybe the most important question, which is whether the feds did in fact violate the First Amendment by proxy. And then they're also going to question the legitimacy and scope of the injunction that was imposed on federal authorities, including the aspects of the Biden White House, at the CDC, the FBI, and CISA as well. So major questions to be grappled with. I think many people are cheering the fact that the Supreme Court is going to take up this case. The fact that a district court and then an appellate court have said that there is merit to the claims of the plaintiffs is obviously a potential massive win for freedom. Now, the downside of the fact that the feds are taking up this case is that they are staying the freeze on Fed-led speech policing, which means that for months now, the feds, up until the case is dealt with, the feds are going to be able to continue potentially leaning on social media companies to suppress wrongthink, including in the middle of a intensely heated election cycle. To that end, there were a few dissenters on the stay issuance aspect of this, including Justices Alito, Thomas, and Gorsuch, which is probably going to preview in part, who's going to lead the case that there were First Amendment violations when the court does grapple with the questions. There are any number of, I think, really poignant remarks that Justice Alito made in his dissent. I think maybe kind of the most important one is how he concludes, saying that what the court has done, I fear, will be seen by some as giving the government a green light to use heavy-handed tactics to skew the presentation of views on the medium that increasingly dominates the dissemination of news, i.e., social media. He also has a quote where he says, "Government censorship of private speech is antithetical to our democratic form of government, and therefore today's decision is highly disturbing." That is the decision not to maintain the freeze on the speech policing. He also acknowledges essentially that by imposing this freeze, that they are going to be leaving political speech open to suppression in the midst of the election cycle. So, again, sort of like the Fifth Circuit, which originally omitted CISA from its injunction and narrowed the injunction, we sort of got a qualified victory there. They ultimately corrected their error, in my view, and imposed the injunction on CISA. I think we're getting a potential partial victory here. That the court is taking this up is a great thing to the extent they rule rightly. But in the interim, speech remains under assault on social media. That's how I see it. I'm curious what you all make of the significance of the case and what you make also of the court staying the injunction.
I think that my big thing that I noticed during the week was that I thought people were very optimistic about the results of this and very positive on the Supreme Court taking the case. But given the posture, the fact that the district court had imposed this injunction and the Fifth Circuit had, essentially refused to stay it, the fact that the Supreme Court is not only taking the case but had lifted the stay was a bad augury, right? This is not a good sign for the outcome of the case for the free speech side. And the fact, especially with, three dissenters who are notably generally the most free speech members of the court in Alito, Thomas, and Gorsuch, this is actually kind of scary. I'm worried about what the outcome is going to be here. That's not to say that this is a lost case by any means. And certainly I'm sure Kavanaugh and Barrett will listen to the arguments of Roberts as well. And that by no means is a reversal guaranteed here. But I'm not optimistic. I think the best outcome here would have been for this case not to be heard by the Supreme Court, for them to just let the Fifth Circuit's decision stand and leave the freeze intact, kind of on the ground, and on the theory that there really isn't, the Fifth Circuit was just right and there's no need for us to hear it here anymore. So I'm concerned that we're going to get a bad, not just this, in short-term problem of political suppression of speech being allowed by the government over the next 12 months, but I'm also very worried about the possibility of just losing this case and having a really bad precedent come down on state social media censorship.
I also do find this to be a very frightening scenario. And especially, so CISA is actually something that Congress is debating at the moment. And there are a whole lot of Republicans, including, people that are generally looked favorably upon by the conservative movement, someone like Mike Gallagher, who are defending parts of CISA and basically, in effect, defending the whole of CISA. So I just wanted to put that out there. I agree. I think we're heading into a somewhat scary sort of territory here as it relates to CISA and as it relates to how the court might make this decision.
I mean, not much to add to what Ben and Will have already laid out, other than to reiterate once again that it's incredibly important that our constitutional structure and the legal system understand how the public and private work together to circumvent basic rights of Americans. And the understanding and the development of a legal doctrine that has contact with reality in this scenario and doesn't rely on this kind of false separation as in terms of the on-the-ground facts between public and private actors, and actually recognizes that they can sort of interact together to produce a certain outcome that the government could not produce by itself because of constitutional limitations. I said when we originally brought up this case several weeks ago that I think this will be a doctrine that's developed over the course of decades. And in some sense, that's understandable, right? This is a new structure of oppression, in my view, new structure of like tyranny, and the way that these kinds of things can be effectuated, like censorship can be effectuated. So in some sense, it's understandable. The court is reluctant to sort of dive into it, but in this case, they are picking up this court. I'm worried. I agree with everything that Will said. Seeing the posture that this case is getting picked up under. That being said, even the fact that they are reviewing this under First Amendment grounds, to me already represents, and this is perhaps due to the Fifth Circuit, already represents a step forward in terms of the doctrinal and legal thinking of this issue, which is not just to do with censorship, right? Like this case is about this public-private partnership for censorship, but there are many other cases in which, and we've laid out over the course of months here on this podcast over and over again, how you have agency actors and then people in Fortune 500 companies and how they can work together to basically circumvent the ability of Americans either to exercise their constitutional rights or to exercise their genuinely civil rights, like to be able to, for example, to determine the future of cultural issues and that are clearly state issues, right? Think about, women's sports in South Dakota and the interference between politics and the private sector there, and the relationships between the state government and the private sector in South Dakota. So I think this is an issue that, again, would be an extremely good thing if the court could start recognizing the reality of these relationships. And I think it's hopeful, even with all the caveats and worries that Will and Ben put forward, I think it's hopeful that the court is at least considering this under a First Amendment structure, because I think it represents the correct way of thinking about how these different actors work together and the ultimate result, which in this case is censorship of Americans expressing their domestic political views.
So while we're on the subject of intellectual battle and information warfare, some of which takes place on social media, let's turn it over to Will to talk about what's going on in the information war on Israel versus its Arab foes.
So yes, we have had two major events. My cat's coming in to say hi. He wants to say hello. Two major events in the past week, which have been subject of like a major information war from the pro-Palestinian side. The first was the alleged hospital bombing, which was, everything about it was false, right? They said that it was Israel bombing a hospital. In reality, it was Palestinian Islamic Jihad rocketing a parking lot in the middle of a hospital. So false in 3 out of 3 respects. And then there was the second one, which was less of a glaring falsehood, but still very deceptive in the sense that there was this statement that Israel had bombed a church. In reality, they had bombed a building adjacent to a church, which sadly did kill a number of Palestinian civilians, including a few of Justin Amash's relatives. But in both cases, essentially, there was this massive information campaign by pro-Palestinian accounts on Twitter to try and spread a narrative that Israel had done something beyond the pale. And if you actually look at some of the accounts that have grown massively in the last few weeks since the Israel-Gaza war started, one in particular, Jackson Hinkle, has grown from like a 300,000 follower account to a 1.3 million follower account in weeks. There's an interesting dynamic where that comes from taking just an absolutist pro-Palestinian line in politics, and that there's just this sea of support for that. And you're wondering, okay, well, where's that coming from? Well, it's a reminder that Muslim Twitter is huge. There are 1.9 billion Muslims in the world and only 16 million Jews. And it's sometimes it's actually kind of easy to forget that fact that in general, the pool of natural pro-Israel support is much, 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 much smaller than the pool of natural pro-Palestine support. And so you get this just wave of not only, falsehood, but essentially encouraged falsehood and encouraged BS coming from the pro-Palestinian side that is just, it's almost overwhelming. And the IDF, I think, and Israel, to their credit, are doing a pretty good job of combating it in the sense of being really, really scrupulously honest. Like if you follow Jonathan Conricus, who's their spokesman, and the IDF official account, they are clearly extraordinarily careful to try and put out things that are true and to tell the truth about exactly what it is their operations are. So when it came to the hospital strike, they were put out, this is not us. here's a bunch of different ways we can prove it wasn't us, et cetera. And on the church right, they just said, look, we admitted it. This is what we were targeting, and this is why. But they're in the unique position that they just have to they have to be completely scrupulous about the truth, because they're in this battle where their adversaries have the benefit of numbers, just an enormous, overwhelming numbers, and broader sympathy on the left. And, even when it came to, for example, the mainstream media, there was just this reflexive reporting of everything Hamas said. And it's I don't have a huge number of conclusions to draw from it on a macro level. And I'm curious what you guys all think about what Israel should do from this. One is that community notes are absolutely essential. Like, I'm as big a free speech advocate on the internet as anybody, but community notes are really important as a corrective to people who just make a business model out of spreading BS and make a business model out of lying. Like, there has to be some sort of broader corrective from the public. And if anything, I'd like there to be a little more enforcement on the community note side, like in the sense that if you keep BSing on community notes, maybe you get a poop emoji next to your name or something for a period of time. But that's one part of it. And then the second is like how challenging it is to deal more broadly, like with the situation that Israel's in. Like, again, you just forget they're just a huge minority relative to the broader Arab world. And so, it's kind of the whole reason. One of the tweets I did yesterday was, it's kind of the whole reason there needed to be a state of Israel in the first place, is that you can't trust the broader world to treat the Jews fairly in general. So I'll leave it there.
It's a good reminder, America is extraordinarily blessed geographically, right? It's a good reminder. Israel is, the size of New York City, population wise, land wise, the size of New Jersey, and it's surrounded by 500 million Muslims in mostly hostile countries towards it, more or less, some of them more, some of them less, right? And so this image that we have of Israel, and I think this has hit home very much for American Jews as well, is especially those under the age of, let's say, 40, we have this invincible image of Israel as much more technologically advanced, much more powerful, much more militarily powerful than the countries around it, and we just have this image that isn't true, that glosses over the precarity, like the inherent precarity of the Israeli position in the Middle East. And I think that's just basically everyone born after the Yom Kippur War, right? Which is the last time that Israel was existentially threatened. And so, yeah, it's good to be reminded of that reality, whether you're in the Middle East or here in America, and blessed with great geography. As much as we dislike the cartels on our open southern border, Mexico as a state is not like inherently hostile to us. Canada is obviously not inherently hostile to us, and we have oceans on either side, and a very, very big country. And that those are all sort of blessings rained upon America in terms of geography, and which still matters even in the 21st century. In terms of the sort of online war. Look, this is now the second war that will be fought like with full social media coverage. I think that's both good and bad, but obviously, like during the early days of the Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we also had all the stuff that was circulating on social media. Some of it propaganda, some of it was true, some of it turned out not to be true. Propaganda from both sides. Like, it was interesting to watch in live time. You think about the propaganda as leaflets being dropped in World War II, but that this is war, right? In this case, as Will said, it's interesting. Israel has to be completely transparent, in a way, because they are, and in a way, sadly, because the posture of the world is largely against them from the start, and nothing could make that clearer than the fact that these attacks on Israel, before Israel had retaliated at all, are what spurred these nationwide condemnations and protests against it, right? Before it had dropped a single bomb in Gaza, there was already condemnation of Israel when they were the aggrieved party. They were attacked by an incursion into their border, and in the most savage and brutal way possible, right? And yet, before they retaliated, they were already on the back foot in the PR war. And nothing could make that clearer in terms of disinformation, real disinformation. online, then the fact that they have to screen for international press corps. In the last few days, they have screened 43 minutes of footage recorded, for the most part, recorded by terrorists themselves, of the various atrocities, things that they had hoped, I think, to keep out of the media for the sake of the families, because there was immediately this machine that kicked on on social media that Will is talking about, that not only spread this false story about the hospital, but also then denied that, for example, that there was rapes that took place, when in fact apparently the rape was so brutal that it broke the pelvises of young women all the way to grandmother age. That denied that there were beheadings. It turns out there were beheadings of babies, among many other horrible things that were done to children, right? And Israel has had to screen that footage for the press corps in an attempt to combat the assertions that essentially they are exaggerating the violence that took place on October 7th. So those are some aspects. And then finally, I guess, in line with the geographic blessings of the United States, we kind of have the luxury of not caring very much what the world thinks, being as powerful a country as we are, because Israel is so small, because their enemies are so disproportionately larger, and for many other reasons too numerous to list. Israel does have to care about the PR war. They can't. It's going to ultimately have a very practical effect on what they are essentially permitted by the international community and the United States to do. So they have to care about that in a way the U.S. doesn't, fortunately for us.
I think there's something, especially when we've seen polling of younger Americans, like 18 to 34 demographic. I don't have the information right in front of me so I can read the numbers, but I think there has been some very obviously concerning polling about, and one I'm thinking of is a Harvard-Harris poll about what percentage of young people, Inez is talking about this later, but I don't have the numbers in front of me. That's all I have to say. Inez will later. What percentage of young people think this is all justified by Hamas? And in the context of this segment, all I want to say is I think young people especially are not used to not understanding exactly what happened at any given time. That is to say, they see footage that feels very real to them coming out of TikTok or on Twitter or on Instagram, and they're told that this is from Gaza. They're told that this is from Israel. And it's very sort of desensitizing. It's enormously confusing. I think all of us are relatively young, but grew up in a different era when, your glimpse into Gaza, your glimpse into Israel came from a CNN camera. And obviously that's shifted enormously over the last 15 years. And so we've sort of been able to get used to it as it was developing. But for people who are young right now, this was basically a mess in their formative years. It continues to be. The mess that we're in now is the mess that they are growing up in. And so I cannot imagine in this media climate what it's been like, especially for younger people. I'm not justifying or excusing any bad ideas. I think we could have a whole conversation about the roots of some of their ideological problems. But it is just, we are failing people on that big question. And I find it very hard even to wrap my head around as someone who's, just only 30, let alone somebody who's like 21.
Well, to that end, first of all, you need a people who can think critically and calmly and deliberately when it comes to matters of war and peace. And, we've raised generations of people, including by dint of the technology itself, that are not able to think long and hard about issues. So then when you have propaganda amplified to the nth degree that fits in a paradigm that people have been propagandized in for decades now, of oppressor and oppressed, and the imperialists and all of the other really Soviet era propaganda, which much of the Arab world glommed onto, particularly around the Palestinian Arab cause. It's ready-made for people to be heavily propagandized and indoctrinated. That the corporate media, legacy media itself has taken the side that it's taken is not at all surprising. You can go back and read Maddie Friedman back in 2014 talking about this, and you can go back throughout history And you can look at the press essentially being on the anti-Israel side of things. So not at all surprising that they got it horribly wrong. Of course, the most quote unquote authoritative voices are the most prominent and prolific purveyors of dis, and malinformation, while they call for censoring it. The only silver lining in this situation, and it's a situation where the peril is probably greater than ever before, because there's always propaganda in war and there's always a fog of war. But now the information can travel and maybe look more credible at a faster speed than ever before. And because the weaponry is also more powerful and quicker, it can cause massive miscalculations in real time in a way that maybe it couldn't before. But the only silver lining, I'd say, is thank God there is a Twitter, for example, that allows for counter narrative and counter messaging, because for a time there would have been only the corporate media, a few networks and a few print publications, and everyone would have been indoctrinated in dis, and malinformation here. So thank God we have social media for situations like these. And on that note, we will talk now with Inez about what the polling shows about public opinion on Israel, Hamas, and beyond.
Yeah, just to follow up on Emily scooping me on my segment. There's been a number of polls, but the one I'm going to cite, I think, makes this clearer. And it's a very straightforward poll in a sense, because the wording of these things is quite tricky, but it asks whether the attacks of October 7th are justified or not justified by the grievances of Palestinians. And I think it's a good way to phrase the question, right? Because it separates out people who might otherwise think, about this is long-running Israeli-Palestinian conflict, right? Might otherwise have some sympathies or think, for example, that the most popular phrase of the last sort of disinformation phrase of the last phase of this war, the cycle of violence, right? It separates out the cycle of violence people. So this is just people who say these attacks specifically are justified or not justified by Palestinian grievance against Israel. And you start out with boomers, right? 65%, 65 years or older. You start out with only 9% of boomers think that these attacks are justified, right? And then with every successive decade decile of age, right? You see this numbers dwindle and dwindle and dwindle. So 55 through 64, 11%. From 9 to 11%, barely a bump, right? In terms of people who think that these attacks are justified. 45 to 54, 23%. So just in that decade, you have a doubling, more than doubling of the number of people who think these kinds of attacks are justified. And then there's a hard break, essentially with millennials, 35 to 44, 39%. Okay, so we're already talking about nearly 4 in 10 people, older millennials, think that these kinds of attacks are justified. You go further down, 25 to 34, 48%, and you're nearly at 50-50. And then finally, 18 to 24, finally a majority in favor, not of any kind of pro-Palestinian, not in favor of two-state solution, but these attacks are justified by Palestinian grievance. The majority of people from 18 to 24 in the United States believe these attacks are justified. And so, this is just one issue, this Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but you will see a similar pattern, and we have been seeing a similar pattern on any basic cultural proposition in the United States. Is the United States a good country? Is the United States racist? Right? Are we the good guys? Do you feel proud to be an American? We see a very, very similar pattern. And to people who find this surprising or shocking, I would say, you really have to re-examine your worldview and see where it does not align with the reality. This is the obvious result of allowing the hard, cultural left, the new left of 1968, to take over the American education system, combined with demographic change. Those are the two factors driving it on this issue and on many other domestic issues of import. This massive generational trends, right, away from things that were once considered not so long ago, when you had a higher proportion of people in these upper three bands, right? Whether they were Republican or Democrat, that they were just supposed to be, basic propositions like the United States is a good country, Western civilization is superior to other civilizations. These kinds of basic propositions, you will find a pattern like this in a generational polling on nearly every one of those questions. And it's important to understand that. And both to do short-term things, both domestically and abroad, to use the majority we have now because of older voters, but also to think structurally, as I know we do, week after week on this podcast, to think structurally about how we can stop and reverse this kind of trend. Because I promise you, this is far from exclusive to, the Israeli-Palestinian issue. And finally, even within the Democratic Party, this is even more pronounced. And you can see that struggle playing out in live time between the statements that President Biden will make supportive of Israel and then the inability of his staff, or sometimes the outright rebellion of his staff, to follow those kinds of directives. So you have the letter signed by 500 staffers, Democratic staffers, congressional staffers, anonymously criticizing the Biden administration for being too pro-Israel in this instance. And then you have the recent exchange from the press secretary's podium, right, where Jean-Pierre could not even answer the question about anti-Semitism without immediately pivoting to anti-Muslim bigotry, right? She and those staffers are representative of the next generation of the Democratic Party. And like in so many things, Biden is a transitionary figurehead. So I don't know what you guys think about these kinds of polls, but I see them not as relevant only to this particular conflict, but as generally indicative of the direction, the cultural direction of American society.
Yeah, I think it's terrible. I'll be very brief. Raise the voting age and seize the endowments. I don't see a reason why people under the age of 25 need to be voting. Sorry. That's just real talk. I think that was the voting age was moved down to 18 in the aftermath of the Vietnam War when we had drafted a bunch of people. We have an all-volunteer force. I think Vivek actually has a very good point, particularly on this issue where he's saying that, if you're young, if you can vote if you serve. But if you don't serve, then you can wait till 25. I think that's step one. And then step two is, our universities are a complete mess. I think Inez has put out a very solid proposal to tax endowments with IWF. We should be treating the universities as a hostile adversarial force in our country, not doing anything to subsidize them. And I think that's still lingering sort of in the Republican Party is, we have a lot of donors who are donating to us, but also giving to their alma maters, and we really should try and get them to stop.
I think this is very much an indication that, I think this speaks to Western civilization and Western civilization's will to survive, because looking at these numbers now, I think they're very much downstream of the decolonization meme, essentially, that is educating American children. It's education by meme. It's not to downplay the work that the colleges are doing, but I think kids are paying even more attention to what they're seeing from Mia Khalifa or whatever on social media about colonization than they are in their history classes. So it's education by meme at this point, and I think that's where, when you ask questions like this, you're going to get responses like this. And if you fundamentally don't agree that this thing is good, this thing that we all participate in is good, it's also incoherent, by the way, with the idea that Israel is committing, as they say, genocide. That absurd allegation that Israel is committing genocide right now by engaging in a war that they did not start. That is ceding the moral high ground to Israel. It is saying that Israel should comply with all of these international norms that we agree on as a Western small L liberal civilization. They know damn well that most of the people in Palestine do not agree with the norms of Western small L liberal civilization. Let's not kid ourselves. Hamas does not follow the international. They're not just trying to abide by every part of the Geneva Convention, but you're ceding the ground that there is a higher moral good that Western countries and allies of Israel are abiding by, that these other countries absolutely wouldn't. So I think it's completely incoherent, and I think that's partially another reason this is really sad. But I think at the same time, there's just this fundamental hatred of the West that has been imbued in the minds of a lot of young people, and we're going to see it spill out When you look at George Floyd, the reaction to George Floyd, when you look at the reaction to the Hamas attack, we're going to see these kind of explosions of anti-Western sentiment when kids are forced to confront it.
Yeah, and I would just add to that I think the most acute form of it, though, is seen in the reaction to Israel and Israel defending itself, attacks on Israel. And I made this case in the book I wrote a few years ago, American Ingrate, which is about how I said that Ilhan Omar, despite the fact that she may look extreme on paper for the Democrat Party, actually personified the future of the party, if not its present, and that was a coalition which included obviously leftists as well as Islamic supremacists, and that the glue that cemented these two otherwise disparate parties, again on paper, is the Jew hatred. And Jew hatred as a proxy for hatred of the Judeo-Christian West and our civilization as a whole. So to that point, I mean, I think what the poll numbers are is a proxy for where these cohorts shake out on a whole slew of other issues. The magnitude of that block of people in America is beyond staggering, though not at all surprising. I wrote about it a few years ago. All of the signs have been there for a long time. I would note again, I mentioned how the Palestinian Arab population kind of colluded with the Soviet Union back really in the 60s to kind of seed these ideas, making it seem as if the struggle was one and the same. And you see that obviously in the rhetoric today. I just point to, and I pulled these quotes pretty recently. So Yasser Arafat, who's the founder of Fatah, who was Soviet groomed, here's a direct quote from him. "Our struggle is part and parcel of every struggle against imperialism, injustice, and oppression in the world. It is the part of the world revolution which aims at establishing social justice and liberating mankind." It's no surprise those words came out of a jihadist's mouth. And then Fatah,
but also Judith Butler basically said the same thing about Hamas.
It's indistinguishable. Fatah in 1969, a statement they wrote: "The struggle of the Palestinian people, like that of the Vietnamese people and other peoples of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, is part of the historic process of the liberation of the oppressed peoples from colonialism and imperialism." I think that just sums it up. You can draw a straight line from that rhetoric to where we are today in America, and it augurs the death of our civilization if there isn't a serious effort to confront the worldview and rip it out root and branch. So on that note, let's go now and shift gears almost completely to Emily to talk about China and Russia.
They want to sell arms to Hamas to help the Sandinistas.
There's an axis here.
It's the reverse of Iran-Contra. No, okay. That actually, in a weird way, is a transition into what I'm going to talk about, which is that Putin and Xi Jinping met last week at a 10-year anniversary of the Belt and Road Initiative, which, speaking of the incoherent takes about people on colonialism, there's a very good conversation to be had about the Belt and Road Initiative as sort of neo-colonialism, neo-imperialism, as it's allowed China to arguably exploit different places in Africa, South America, etc., with this actually fairly clever approach towards their hegemony, their goal of hegemony. And this got very little attention in the media, perhaps understandably so, because the images coming out of Israel were just continuously shocking. The news was continuously important, but this is perhaps the most important subplot in our geopolitics right now, because we are, and I mean this not hyperbolically, teetering on the precipice of a conflict that could look a lot like a World War III, because we are seeing axes and allies start to coalesce in ways that is fairly terrifying, ways that are fairly terrifying under the Biden administration. Putin and Xi Jinping reiterated, fabulously so, their friendship upon meeting last week in Beijing. Again, this is the third Belt and Road Summit. It was the 10-year anniversary. They have been moving closer together actually since Putin's invasion of Ukraine, which China has not yet condemned. They have called for a ceasefire. When it comes to Israel, they have tried to play sort of a peace broker in the Middle East, mostly without success. but this is their effort to sort of take over and say, we can do what America is supposed to do. We're just going to do it better. There's a lapse of American leadership on the world stage. The American moment is over. So we're going to step into the void and we can be real peace brokers. And that's, one conversation, but the other conversation is how very fragile the sort of world order is right now. When you look at the possibility of Iran becoming sort of a huge front in what we're seeing happen with Israel and Gaza right now, Lebanon, like we are hanging in the balance. If there's a major strike from Hezbollah and Israel goes towards Iran, reasonably so, again, because of Hezbollah and Iran's connection, Iran and Hamas's connection. If that is escalated, we're going to be teetering even more on the precipice. Like, this is just a very, very fragile geopolitical ecosystem right now. And I think Putin and Xi Jinping's meeting last week underscores that we now have major nuclear powers aligned against the United States, and whose interests are at stake in a war that has become hot, a hot war right now in the Middle East, and a hot war in Ukraine. So the potential for just a global escalation, especially over Taiwan, which Walter Russell Mead and Ross Douthat in the last couple of days have noted looms very large over this conversation about Israel. This is going in, I think, really terrifying directions really quickly. So let me open the floor up to everybody else for their thoughts on the handshake, the meeting, and the professed closeness between both of these countries last week.
I guess I'll go. I think it's a diplomatic disaster, right? Like I look back to what Nixon did in the 1970s, which is Nixon went to China and realized that if there are going to be three great powers in the world, you want to be on the side of two rather than the side of one. And right now, our diplomacy, and this isn't really just about the war in Ukraine, it's really more about our diplomacy over the past decade or so, has been to push Russia into the arms of China. And I'm not a believer that really is in the United States' best interest. And I very much worry that we are wildly overstretched. You think about, we're trying to add support for Israel, which you don't really ultimately need to do because, Israel can defend itself. That combined with Ukraine, we're totally underinvested in dealing with China, which is the obvious biggest threat to our national security, the biggest great power competitor that we're facing. And yeah, I'm very worried about it. I think that it's definitely a failure of American diplomacy that we've gotten to this point. That's not to say that like Russia's justified in whatever it does, but certainly the outcome here where it seems like, we have NATO and that's it. And basically all the rest of the world's great powers are up against us. Not a good sign.
Well, since you invoked Nixon and I guess Kissinger as well, at least as a proxy for it, I went back and I looked once at some of the cables and internal documents that were generated when they were talking about this is the Sino-Soviet split. And there's a quote from Kissinger that I'm paraphrasing, where he said, now we'll have to lean towards China. We'll have to lean towards China to split it off from Russia. But down the road, essentially, China is going to become very formidable, and we might have to lean back to Russia. And that proved prescient. I don't agree with Kissinger on everything or necessarily a lot of things, but that did end up proving a prescient premonition. And I think one of the reasons that it was so frustrating that the entire Russiagate narrative was blown up and that there was a moral panic over it is that Trump wanted to try to ensure that Russia and China were cleaved. Not that necessarily there would have been legitimate common ground with Russia and that it wouldn't have tried to stab us in the back in any kind of way in which we tried to coordinate and have a cessation and hostility with Putin, which would have been helped, of course, because of Trump's strength. But essentially, Russiagate killed any chance of ensuring that we could at least try to keep Russia closer to our orbit than China, or try to stir up unrest between Russia and China. And consequently, now you have this senior partner in China, junior partner in Russia, all of their proxies around the world. When it comes to China, obviously with North Korea and others that it's trying to curry favor with through Belt and Road, and that it is influenced in all manner of ways through its efforts abroad. And then obviously Russia as well, with Iran and Syria and other powers. So yeah, we've created a disastrous scenario in which we have this block of enemies and adversaries, many of which their proxies operate in our hemisphere as well. Our borders are wide open. We've eviscerated our dominance in energy, frittered it away completely, and given the game essentially to the other oil producing countries, and then the countries that make the green technologies that we're supposed to transition to, namely China. So all around it's disastrous. Then you have the overstretched nature of the military. You have the woke nature of the military. You have our lack of defense industrial base that's equipped to deal with what's ahead of us. And on every single one of these metrics, things look incredibly bleak, despite the fact that we still have the capability, in my view, to counter anyone who would dare threaten us. To me, it remains more a question of will than capability, notwithstanding the major challenges we face. So I agree. It's a completely bleak situation, and in many ways brought upon by a third term of Obama-Biden policies that I always, I kind of ask the rhetorical question, but if you were trying to empower and embolden your enemies and weaken your allies and yourself, what would you do differently than kind of the Obama-Biden agenda? And we're seeing the consequences of it. The consequences of it are not peace. The consequences of it are a world in utter chaos and our interests threatened at home and abroad.
Yeah, couldn't agree more with Ben's summary. Although, just as always, I'm skeptical that any kind of reset with Russia was ever possible. Every American administration, going back to FDR, has tried a reset with Russia. I think there are deep and fundamental hostile feelings between, actually, largely, I think, cultural. Not everybody is sort of this mercantile, the rising tide lifts all boats. We trade together and it's good for both of us. Not every culture or civilization has this mentality. This is an American and to some extent an Anglo mentality, but generally very, very much agree with everything that Ben has said, and would distill it in a question, which is, would we have a hot and bloody war on the European continent? And would this attack have happened in Israel if Trump had won the election and become president? If Trump was president now, and I know that these kind of counterfactuals are always, necessarily speculative, but given the fact that Putin started amassing troops on the Ukrainian border under 2 weeks after we showed the world our rear end in Kabul, not just withdrawing from there, but which Trump intended to do too. But I have a hard time believing that it would have been carried out in the way that it was carried out, that really demonstrated American weakness so fully to the world. So that's one. And then two, would Iran have been emboldened to help plan, fund, and really spur this kind of attack in Israel? For starters, they probably wouldn't have had unfrozen $6 billion. But generally, the pro-Iran leanings of both, and I think it has been said very well, the third term of the Obama administration, because these things really started under the Obama administration and were reversed under Trump's. Those two things alone, weakness begets chaos. And I think that's a very sobering thing for sort of people who still don't like Trump. Even sometimes I'm in this camp, right, on the domestic front, that there is an enormous difference and an enormous advantage to having an American president who is a little unpredictable, who isn't beholden to certain groupthinks of sort of the Washington foreign policy blob, even if I don't always agree that deviations from that are 100% correct all the time. There is an enormous advantage to having a president like that. And we're seeing, unfortunately, play out in blood the consequence of American weakness. And then this summit, regarding the summit specifically, right, we should be very worried. If we were a serious power, we would be very, very worried about this. There's also they're building a pipeline between Russia and China to carry oil, to shift Russia's reliance on the West in terms of selling their natural resources, and pivoting towards the Asian market. One thing from this summit that I found particularly, just to tie all this together, all of this, that the fact that it's not an accidental alliance between sort of Judith Butler, who are the two people, Judith Butler and Yasser Arafat, right? It's not an accidental alliance. President Xi actually used the phrase, this alliance is on the right side of history, right? So they're very good at echoing the self-hating domestic lingo of the United States that is so deadly in our ability to rise to what increasingly seems like an era of great powers conflict.
So that kind of kicks off our parting shots, and I'll be really brief with a follow-up there, a tangential follow-up. But I've been tracking, I argued in a piece in the Federalist that there was a coming bear hug between the U.S. and Israel, where the Biden administration was going to act like it was being a friend and an ally and a partner, but in reality seek to restrain Israel, stop it, deter it from actually pursuing vigorously its national interest, and ultimately micromanage what may end up being something like a quagmire / stalemate with Gaza as the administration continues to, again, restrain it in all manner of ways. And I just want to point out that there's been some reporting done indicating that Israelis are kind of aghast at the idea now that they are in hock to and reliant on the U.S. essentially selling it weapons and potentially conditioning those sales with strings attached on how they are used, and the posture the Biden administration has taken towards them and how it constrains them and ultimately makes them dependent and reliant on the U.S. to dictate Israeli policy. I think down the road, however this shakes out, that may well augur Israel itself hedging and turning towards other powers who will be less controlling. And obviously that it would not be good for anyone's interest ultimately, but it would be understandable that they would look abroad to the extent their sovereignty and interests are under threat because of American meddling and intervention. And I think that also sends a signal to other powers around the world who look to the U.S. as an ally, a partner, a friend, etc. Are they going to look abroad and look to hedge potentially as a consequence of what we've seen in U.S. treatment of Israel and what I think is going to continue in a bear hug? So something to watch going forward, and obviously a disastrous development, I think, all around.
My final thought, I'm going to return back home to the domestic. Douglas Macky was sentenced to prison this week, 7 months in prison for posting a meme. I couldn't find this information in all of the articles written about it, including on the Department of Justice's website, but I assume this is a felony. The maximum sentence was 10 years. He got 7 months. So I assume that in addition to doing 7 months in prison, he will lose his right to vote, his right to bear arms, right? For posting a meme identical to many memes posted about the election by Democrats, and there are endless examples of this. Really, this really is, I would say, the first sort of parting shot outside of Trump himself on free speech, in such a direct way. Where you're not even talking about the censorship of social media companies, the subject of Missouri against Biden that we talked about at the beginning of the podcast, but a very direct use of this vague statute that is really intended to stave off things like burning a cross on someone's lawn to prevent them from voting, to stretch that to apply to memes on the internet about voting on Wednesday or whatever that are literally as old a joke as there is surrounding elections. But it does show that there is a piece of our justice system that is as many other parts of our justice system are weaponized exclusively against conservatives in a way that is very directly government censoring speech, literally criminalizing joke memes on Twitter. So that is worth paying attention to. It's a statute that has come up in the Trump charges. It's a statute that's come up, I think, in some of the January 6th trials as well. I think it will be a statute that the left is going to attempt to stretch and use to cover what is clearly First Amendment protected speech in the United States. So Douglas Mackey going to prison, this is not a good sign for speech in the United States.
I'm curious about the trend of young people reacting to the crumbling of the sort of Pax Americana, because I do wonder if some things start to rattle them out of the memified comfort bubble of America is so evil and bad. And sadly, I think that's because things are about to get worse. I wonder if that, I think, I don't know what the breakdown will be. I'm sure for others, it'll make them completely double down, as has been the case here, and say this is all America's fault because they're being told that by other know-nothings on the internet. On the other hand, I do think the scarier things get, the more moral clarity will start to appear for some people. And that's one thing that I'm definitely watching for going forward.
So on similar to what Inez was talking about, more lawfare, Jenna Ellis had to plead guilty in Georgia court today to one count of aiding and abetting some false statements in court. I don't remember exactly. I don't want to say exactly what the count was, but I don't have it in front of me. More example of lawfare. There's been a trajectory of these defendants taking no jail plea agreements when they're facing a major felony charge from Fani Willis and the RICO charge in particular. And honestly, the fact that they're taking these plea agreements doesn't really give any indication that they're actually guilty. They're effectively coerced into doing so by these extraordinary sentences that are available under the RICO Act. So I feel very sorry for Jenna that she had to do this, but it also goes to show just like how ridiculous that particular piece of lawfare is in Georgia, and connects more broadly the ridiculous lawfare that's going on against the former president, something that we'll need to keep talking about over the coming weeks.
Well, on that depressing note, on behalf of Emily, Inez, and Will, thanks for tuning in. I'm Ben Weingarten, and we'll see you at the next NatCon Squad.